Hey guys, I'm going to take another diversion and read this article called The Use of Temporary Prosthesis and Adjustable Walking Jig by Dr. Mueller. He was the chief of the Veteran Administration. This was written in 1956, 1957. And I think there's a lot of things that I totally agree with, and maybe some that I'm kind of borderline on this. But I think the lessons that we can take of it, especially for us as prosthetists, to get the patients their best results, I think is super important. So this is the first time I've run across this, and I know, and I'm going to be talking about these walking jigs, temporary prostheses for the younger patients. So it definitely goes into the idea of adjustable sockets and such in the future. So apparently, this Dr. Leavitt had written an article and probably called a pylon a prosthesis, and so they go on to delineate what the different types of prostheses are: permanent prosthesis, temporary prosthesis, a peg leg or pylon prosthesis, and then stubbies like we do for bilateral above the knee patients. This is where things really get good, I think. It must be appreciated that all artificial legs, and I would say arms, cannot arbitrarily be classed into one or the other of the above definitions. Variants to meet existing disabilities and other factors will at times nullify the attempts to formally catalog an artificial leg. So essentially, everybody's different, and there's just no one cookie-cutter approach. And I think this is important and very encouraging for prosthetists and orthotists, is that even though there's a lot of people scanning and creating devices, they're just doing it for one-off. We as prosthetists and orthotists, we can do it for multiple people because we're creative, we understand ground reaction forces, anatomy, underlying anatomy, and we can do this over and over and over for different types of patients, because that's what we've been taught, that's what we've learned. So it's definitely a separator, and it's neat to see that a doctor would give us that much credit. So I do appreciate that. And this, I think, is very, very important. The idea of a temporary prosthesis apparently must have been a big deal. So just get people up and walking. And this doctor's like, hey, that may not be the right way to look at things, especially when you're talking about a temporary prosthesis. So he goes on and says, fitting a prosthesis is not a simple task. The alignment of the limb, the selection of component parts, and the fit and construction of the socket is a serious problem that the VA is delegating primarily to physicians who have been specially trained in prosthetics and to prosthetists who have taken graduate courses on the subject. So this was before prosthetics was really a formal school education track. Now things get really interesting. He goes into this. When temporary limbs are used to provide a quick and inexpensive substitute for an amputated limb, the components of the limb are necessarily of lower quality and workmanship than those that will be provided in the permanent limb. It is natural that the temporary limb will not afford the fit and function that the permanent limb will offer, and the wearer must acclimate himself to a limb that nearly fits and functions. And I think what's encouraging to me in that sentence, and we'll see it a little bit later on, is that the doctor is saying, hey, let's think twice about this idea of nearly fitting. Let's really fit the patient to get them up and going quickly. Nearly fitting somebody causes a lot of issues. And I see this a lot in the developing world, where sometimes somebody says, oh, well, that's good enough. Well, at least we got them up and walking. Understand a little bit, but the harm later on, if they are able to get a more permanent prosthesis, might already be done. And that permanent prosthesis, we might not be able to get them walking as well. So he goes on. It is natural that the temporary limb will not afford the fit and function that nearly fits and functions. He will obtain his first or her first prosthetic impressions from this poorly fitting limb and may be psychologically conditioned against all limbs in the future. I've seen this a lot in the upper extremity world, especially in the developing world, where things just haven't fit and the patient just doesn't want anything to do with it. Pretty interesting. This part is super important. This idea of nearly fitting somebody. It is entirely conceivable that he may develop bad walking habits with the temporary limb which he will never be able to overcome when he receives his permanent limb. I can't say it any better than that. Let's get people up and going and not allow them to even get into their bad walking habits. Talk about standard materials, wood, metal, fiber. He does talk about older patients and this idea of a temporary prosthesis just to see if they're motivated. But he makes very clear, however, even this older amputee should not be fitted with a temporary limb made from remnants of discarded limbs and by a technician who has the ability to assemble parts, but many not have the knowledge of fabricating a dynamically acceptable limb. This really hit home for me because there are times in the past where I haven't fully optimized a prosthesis for the patient and given them the best chance possible. And this idea of you may, you look in your cupboard and, oh, I've got a foot that's almost the category for the patient. That is, especially on these older patients, that is not the right way to go because, again, you're not optimizing them to have the best outcome. So something to think about for sure. The components of the temporary limb, even with those older amputees, should approximate those that will eventually be incorporated into the permanent limb, and the technician making the temporary prosthesis should be fully qualified in his trade. I don't know that I can say it much better than that. And this last part, I think, is also important. Turning to the question of an adjustable walking jib, the most recent course on AK prosthetics at New York University does not favor long and unsupervised use of the jig by the amputee. The patient can easily change the set screws and other controls in the knee while he is unsupervised and thereby throw the original alignment out of plumb. This would defeat the time and effort expended in the attempt to align the limb properly when the jig was set originally. Its use should be limited to the supervised shop under the direction of a trained prosthetist for such periods of time as is necessary to determine the optimum alignment that can be provided in an artificial limb. It's definitely a warning against some of the adjustable sockets, and I just want to close with a story on that. I have a patient that came in one of the latest adjustable socket designs. And because it was adjustable and patient adjustable, he was definitely adjusting it. But here's the problem. He had no feeling in the distal part of his leg. And he would just tighten up the socket as much as he could because he couldn't feel it, but he knew he wanted something tight. And he ended up having an ulcer on his distal end for a long period of time before he ended up coming to us, and we put him into a quote-unquote traditional style socket where he quickly healed up. So while the idea of adjustable socket is pretty awesome, and there are patients, and I have patients that I've put into them, it definitely isn't for everybody. And then when you're in the situation where you have a patient that's not able to feel, sometimes it's not the best thing for them to be able to adjust. Sometimes we need to protect the patients from themselves so they can stay comfortable. And So it's really a two-edged sword, and the doctor confirms it here. The idea of this adjustable walking jig, if it can be changed by the patient, it will be changed by the patient. It could be for better, could be for worse. So it's just an encouragement to us as prosthetists to really get to know our patients well and give them what is best for them. And sometimes that means not giving them the new shiny toy and just fitting them with a good fitting socket so they have a great experience in their prosthesis. So anyway, thanks for watching, guys. I hope this is helpful to you. Just some wisdom from 1957 that I really appreciated from this doctor, Dr. Mueller.